I'm Isaac, my pronouns are they, them, I'm a trans feminine non-binary person and I'm autistic. That means a lot of different things for different people. For me, the way I read social cues and body language, experience sensory input, and express myself is pretty different from most people. I also have anxiety and depression.
I'm Krishna, my pronouns are they, them. I'm non-binary and I have depression, which means sometimes I experience a total lack of motivation and periods of intense despair. I also have anxiety.
I'm Kokava, my pronouns are they, or they, them. I'm non-binary, I'm autistic, and I have ADHD and psychosis.
That means we're all transgender and neurodivergent.
For anyone who hasn't heard the term neurodivergent,
It's a word to describe anyone whose way of thinking
understanding information,
And interpreting their environment,
is significantly different to what society usually expects.
that is, it diverges from the majority.
There's also a word for people who aren't neurodivergent.
and that's neurotypical.
There are lots of ways to be neurodivergent.
From autism
To ADHD,
to depression,
psychosis,
OCD, personality disorders, intellectual disabilities, and so many more.
I have depression and anxiety, and those are definitely mental illnesses. They're negative things that make my life worse. And ideally, I'd like to stop being anxious and depressed. There are also forms of neurodivergence, because there's still ways that my mind diverges from the typical.
Being autistic is a really important part of who I am. There's no non-autistic version of me. That would be a completely different person. Same with ADHD, and I definitely wouldn't call either of those mental illnesses. But I'm also psychotic, and that is a mental illness. And definitely something I'd want to change.
My autism is fundamentally important to who I am, and it's not a mental illness. Anxiety and depression are mental illnesses, but they're still parts of me, and they've shaped who I am. What aspects of those I want to change, and how I change them, are entirely up to me.
Unfortunately, not everyone is accepting of neurodivergent people.
There's a word for the discrimination that neurodivergent or disabled people face: ableism,
And this can be especially difficult for trans people.
who have to deal with the intersection of ableism and transphobia.
You can be both.
It's an area we don't talk about a lot.
But it's often harder for neurodivergent people to be taken seriously when we come out as trans or gender diverse.
Some people will use our neurotypes to dismiss our genders.
Usually by claiming that neurodivergent people can't understand gender.
Or by treating our genders as a symptom.
For some of us, our gender identities are linked to being neurodivergent.
But that's not the case for everyone.
Being autistic influences how I think about everything, and that includes my gender. Having BPD is also part of why I've thought so carefully about my identity in lots of different areas. I don't know if I'd still be non-binary if those things weren't a part of who I am, but they are, so it really doesn't matter. I'm transgender and I'm neurodivergent. It's not possible for me to separate those things, and I wouldn't want to.
My anxiety and depression are totally separate from my gender identity. I'm not depressed or anxious because I'm transgender, and being transgender is not a symptom of being neurodivergent for me. The transphobia I face can contribute to my anxiety and depression. But if one day I'm not dealing with depression or anxiety, I'm still going to be transgender.
Our experiences are all different and all equally valid.
Trans spaces aren't always accessible for neurodivergent people, and it's really important to make all our spaces inclusive.
Here are ways to do that.
Accessing trans or queer spaces can sometimes be harder for neurodivergent people.
Because our minds work differently,
Things that neurotypical trans people are comfortable with,
Aren't always the things that work best for us.
if the event is really loud or has a lot of flashing lights or is really crowded,
having a chill-out space that anyone can access can really help out.
So that we can take a break if the sensory input is getting overwhelming, or if we don't feel like talking to people right then.
resources are usually written with neurotypical trans people in mind.
Which means that some of us can find them difficult too.
Presenting information in different formats, like video and text,
Like we've done for these videos.
Is really helpful.
And it's a good idea to consult with intellectually disabled young people on how to write plain language versions too.
The language used to talk about trans people can also be really stigmatizing for neurodivergent people.
The idea that being transgender is a mental illness is obviously false.
And it's led to a lot of mistreatment for trans people.
But when we talk about that, it's important to make sure we don't throw mentally ill trans people under the bus.
Saying being transgender isn't a mental illness is totally fine.
But saying trans people aren't mentally ill erases trans people who are also mentally ill.
When we talk about the stigmatizing treatment that trans people have faced,
it's important to make clear that mentally ill people don't also deserve that treatment.
if we say when being transgender is treated as a mental illness, trans people are treated badly. But being trans isn't a mental illness, so our autonomy ought to be respected.
It can sound like we're saying it's okay to not respect people's autonomy if they are mentally ill.
That's obviously not what we believe, so we need to phrase it differently.
Things get even trickier for those of us who are considering some form of medical transitioning.
Neurodivergent and neurotypical trans people can both run into problems with the medical system.
From medical professionals who don't have adequate training,
To people who try to reduce our trans identity to a medical issue.
But this is even harder for neurodivergent trans people.
doctors and other medical professionals often don't know how to support neurodivergent trans people.
That can be because they're not familiar with our needs,
Don't have much experience with us,
Haven't received enough training,
or most importantly, haven't heard enough from neurodivergent trans people about how to support us.
After all, we're the experts in our experiences. We're living them all the time.
Unfortunately, bias within the medical community can also make things harder for neurodivergent trans people.
There are still some medical professionals who think we can't understand our identities well enough to know that we want to transition.
And when some doctors see diagnoses like borderline personality disorder,
Their own misconceptions can lead them to delay our transition.
While this can come from a well-meaning place, being overcautious actually hurts neurodivergent trans people.
many of us have to fight to access any form of medical transition.
And forcing us to delay our transition or jump through a lot of unnecessary hoops
Puts many of us in a really distressing situation.
Fear of having our access to medical transitioning blocked
can also lead some trans people to avoid getting help from mental health professionals if we do need it.
In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to choose between getting the right kind of mental health support
or being able to access the medical support that we need.
To have a body that we're comfortable and happy with.
Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in yet.
Just like neurotypical trans people,
Neurodivergent trans people understand our identities best.
We deserve to decide what happens to our bodies too.
there are lots of ways to make events and resources accessible to neurodivergent trans people.
And we've only covered a few here.
Making that extra effort is a bit more work, but it's definitely worth it.
Neurodivergent trans people have as much right to access trans spaces as our neurotypical peers.
Besides, embracing that diversity actually makes our communities much stronger and much better.
If you enjoyed this video and learned something from it, share it online to help spread the knowledge to even more people.
And if you'd like to learn more, check out the rest of Trans 101.